Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to this public debates of the Norman Foster Foundation. I'm Tim Stoner. I'm an architect and urban planner in private practice, and I'm a member of the advisory board of the foundation. We're here to discuss the really important subject of materiality, from what we make the buildings that provide shelter to the people who live in the towns and cities of a rapidly growing planet. We're here to talk about the energy and the cost of creating those materials, but also the impacts they have socially and environmentally on the planet in return. The wrong choice of materials can have profound consequences for the way in which the future of this planet will unfold. And of course, the right choice can give us not just a lower carbon footprint, but it can address inequalities in society. We have 6 keynote speakers who are all experts in their field. You've got information in your packs on each of them, and I'm not going to introduce any at length because I want to provide the time for them to talk themselves about these issues. The way that the debates are going to happen is in 2 parts. We'll have 3 keynote speakers who will speak each for 5 minutes, and then they'll join me on stage and we'll discuss the issues that come out of their presentations. We'll repeat that in the second part of the debates. I encourage you to follow on social media using the hashtags that you can see on the screen here, but also I hope we'll have some time for you to ask your own questions from this audience physically here. And we've got microphones that will go around. You'll make my job easy by making yourselves obvious to me. Put your hand up, show me that you wish to engage, and I'll try to bring you into the debates. So it leaves me just to welcome the first of our speakers, who is also the mentor for the week-long workshop on the Re-Materializing of housing, which is supported by the Holcim Foundation. And we acknowledge their support for the week-long event, the scholars who are joining us today who are part of that, and our mentor, Dirk Hebel, who is going to give the first keynote. Dirk is Professor of Sustainable Construction at Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany, and the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. This is quite a format because we were asked to talk in the keynote for 5 minutes, and I thought I would bring some provocations to you. When we talk about the building industry today, we should not forget that the building industry today is responsible for 50% of all primary energy consumption. We should also not forget that the building industry is responsible for 40% of all CO2 and greenhouse emissions. It is also true that the building industry is responsible for 36% of solid waste by weight, and also it is responsible for 50%, half, of all primary resource consumption. The reason for that is that we planners and designers simply design wrongly. We design in a linear ideology. We think that when we plan and when we design, we stop the moment that people move into our buildings. We started a discussion maybe 20 years ago that we should also look at the time span when that building is used. But I think we even have to extend that and start thinking what happens with those buildings afterwards, and most importantly, talking about materials here in this workshop in Madrid, is how do we design in such a way that these materials and these building elements are used again for future generations to fulfill their needs and to fulfill their dreams for housing and living in dignity. So what needs to change? And I brought 5 points today that I would like to discuss with you. Don't you think that in the future, when we submit our building permits, we should also ask for a dismantling permit? Shouldn't we designers who decide in the end how we construct buildings not only say how we construct it to put it together, but also submit plans and calculations and maybe digital information how to dismantle them and bring them back, these materials and building elements, to a circular economy? Should we not have regulations on a political level asking for the reconstruction and the reuse of buildings? Should we not, instead of saying or just assuming that when we have the commission for a new building and there's maybe a building already existing on that piece of land, that we, architects, planners, and designers, should start arguing why we would like to take that existing building down, instead of assuming that this is okay anyhow? Should we not have reduced tax? Should we not kind of question our tax system in the building industry for those materials which come from a secondary material stream? Why should we pay tax twice for the same material as it is today? And why do we accept this? Should we not have in the future digital material registers, saying that every building that we construct needs a digital twin, and that this information of the digital twin informs also future generations how to reuse these materials, buildings, or building elements? And should this digital library should not be available for everybody in a society of democracy? And my last point, I think we need new evaluation systems. We need new registers or kind of ideas of how to evaluate the question of sustainability, or in my case, I'm talking about the circularity of buildings and materials, how we can actually make this a system that we can judge if one building, in the sense of circularity, is better than the other. And shouldn't we learn from popular systems as we go to supermarkets today and look at green, yellow, and red labels, or if we look at our washing machines in these labels, shouldn't we do the same for buildings? That everybody of us, informed or uninformed, or architect or designer, or none of them, can basically see and understand what it means to be in the evaluation system. So far from my side, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dirk. Our next speaker is Anna Heringer, who is an architect who has pioneered the use of natural materials in her work, which I think, as you'll see, is distinguished as much for the processes of design and construction as the buildings themselves. Anna, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Tim. I firmly believe architecture is a tool to improve lives. Unfortunately, also the opposite is true. We just saw it. Architecture can destroy. But I believe we human beings and our profession can do better than the status quo. We can build buildings, we can also foster communities, and we can do this in harmony with nature. In the end of my career, when I'm summing up all the building budgets that went through my hands, and in the end of my life, I want to be able to tell myself, hey, Anna, you supported the right people, those who really needed it. And I want to be able to tell myself, you know, I kept the planet somehow healthy for the coming generations. Building with natural materials such as earth, timber, fiber is labor intensive and thus also really fosters social justice. And in its essence, those materials are also CO2 neutral and climate neutral. So for me, using these materials is an essential need for, you know, reacting on two of our major challenges that we have as a humanity, as a planet, the climate change and the social injustice. Building with natural materials is easier said than done. It's actually really costly to do so. It's more costly to build a wall out of earth than building a wall out of concrete, and it's obviously not the mistake of the earth or those kind of building materials, since they are the building material of the poor. It is the problem of our economic system. But the good news is this is not a natural force. It's man-made, so we can change it, and we have to. So if we look closely at those materials, it's not, the material that is costly because per se they are given by nature for free. It's the labor-intensive work that is highly taxed in our part of the world. Although, CO2 is very low taxed, so this kind of imbalance is really causing us problems. As I think in our part of the world, we really have to look closely on all the rules and regulations. I mean, I've started working in the developing world in the global south in Bangladesh, then started to work in Germany. It's no fun. I mean, every decision, for a sustainable building material, for a sustainable way, is the more costly one. And it's something we really have to look at all the rules and regulations. Whom do they profit? This is for me always the key question. Who gets the profit? And we architects, we have a major challenge in front of us. I mean, we have to say no to commissions that we cannot ethically embrace. We really have to say no. We also have to invest more time in planning and not just go for standardized things and solutions. We really have to invest also time in communication to convince people, clients, politicians. We have to also be more political. But I think there is lots to gain. I think we can gain the feeling, to do a meaningful work, and that is a lot. I want to briefly show the power of the process, because for me, the outcome is just as important as the process. And that was in Worms in Germany, my first commission at home. It was a cathedral that had its 1,000-year-old anniversary, and the community wanted to give, for this purpose, a new altar, which was a difficult task to do because the interior that you see here is of Balthasar Neumann, the famous Baroque architect. And we proposed not to bring the ready-made object. We proposed to bring the material and the tools, and the people started building and ramming their own altar where they celebrate the communion. So really everyone was involved, from the kids, altar boys, girls, the choir, community council, and everyone. And it was really wonderful to see how the building process can really act as a catalyst for fostering also communities. We can build a building, at the same time we can build up a community. And that is the power of the process of architecture. This picture for me is very symbolic. In the background you see all the gold, and as a society we are not lacking of materials. We are lacking of good relationships, and we are lacking of meaning. And this is what we can also provide with our projects. So what's the question? Form follows what? I think we can do much more than form follows function, and we have to. There are a lot of functional buildings around, there are a lot of good-looking buildings around, but we need meaningful buildings and truly beautiful buildings. And what is beauty? It's a big question. To me, beauty is a formal expression of love. And if we do things out of love towards the planet, towards people, we naturally do it sustainable. So for me, it would be form follows love. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. The final speaker in our first part of the public debates is Stuart Smith. Stuart is a structural engineer. He leads a multidisciplinary team at Arup in Berlin, and I will pass the baton to him. Thank you, Stuart.
So as a young structural engineer, I wanted to be able to design sustainable buildings. And I searched for solutions and never found anything that I was completely happy with until now. I was inspired by the work of Ed Batinsky. He's a Canadian photographer, and he photographs landscapes where man has had a huge impact. This one is nickel tailings, and I wanted to know more about nickel and where it came from and what we did with it. We use it in stainless steel, so it ends up in our buildings. And our buildings generate a huge amount of construction waste at the end of life. So in the European Union, we generate something like 375 million tonnes of waste from demolition and construction every year, and it's a fairly reliable stream. So I wanted to know, what is 375 million tonnes? Well, I happen to know the Empire State Building weighs 330,000 tonnes. This means we're disposing of 1,000 buildings of that scale every year in the European Union. And these are major implications in terms of materials before you even start to think about carbon. We know that the building industry is responsible for about 40% of the carbon that's generated. In a building that's designed well today, embodied carbon in the materials is responsible for about 50% of the total carbon in that building. So this is a major topic for us now. And then we have problems of landfill. Although we're recovering a lot of the construction and demolition waste, it's often downcycled, and still a lot of our materials end up in landfill in our cities. So talking to colleagues and exploring the opportunities that we had to solve all of these problems in one, I came across the circular economy, the principle simply of keeping materials at the highest value for as long as possible. And I wanted to explore how we could apply this to the built environment. So I came up with the idea of a prototype building, which I built in London for the London Design Festival 5 years ago. The idea was to explore all of these principles in one prototype. We took materials from the building industry, the idea of putting them all together, and at the end of life, giving them all back to their suppliers. We used QR codes to record all of the materials and have a material passport to give the materials identity so we knew what happened to them. And I found the work of Stuart inspiring. He studied how buildings change over time, and he broke buildings down into their layers, and I used that as a reference to design the project. So I'm going to go through each of those layers and just give you some examples of what I learned. We used steel that we recovered from ArcelorMittal in Luxembourg, and we didn't change it. We used what we found, and we gave it back to them afterwards. Only about 5% of our steel is recycled in this way. And for the building cladding, we used a material called Ecoya, which is a softwood, grows very fast, but by pickling it, it's a kind of pickling process that then gives it the durability of a hardwood, so it can be used over and over again. And then for the building services, we 3D printed our own mechanical ventilation unit using recycled plastics that you could take apart. A lot of the carbon that's in our building is in our building services, so we need to rethink the way we operate and run our buildings. And then how do you use space flexibly? So we wanted to be able to create a building that had flexible use of space, and then it could be used and utilised at much higher values, and we have so many buildings that aren't utilised at their highest value that stand empty. And then for the internal finishes, we used a lot of cradle-to-cradle materials. And this is where the circular economy is really starting to already have an impact. So the carpets were loaned from a company called Desso, who will take the carpets back at the end of life and remanufacture them. So we're not even starting to own the materials, we're just starting to pay and rent for a service. So my proposal is that we not only optimise the system and the elements within which we work, but we try to change the system to one that's circular, where we can recover and reuse materials and solve all of the materials problems that we have with one change to our system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you, and I'm going to invite Dirk and Anna to join me on the stage here to engage in a discussion with your participation, if you wish, about the issues that we've just heard. And Dirk, if I could start with you, and by the way, thanks to the three of you for giving what I thought was very clear and provocative thoughts about the ways in which we need to change. And what I'd like to do is try and explore how we do that, what the kinds of inertias are in our systems that are preventing us from moving as fast as we need to. But Dirk, if I could start, you described the importance of valuing material, not just in the traditional terms of valuing the extraction, the processing, the bringing to site, the assembly, but you added the removal, disassembly, and repurposing. Can I push you a little further? Because those seem to me to be the economic costs of materiality, but what about the social costs? Yep. What about the environmental costs that are part of these processes? And if I could just ask you to focus, what would that mean for concrete? What would that mean for plastic?
Well, let me start with a statement. I mean, I don't want to come across as a technocrat, right? I don't think that everything else we have on the table as planners and designers should be taken off. I think sustainable architecture has to be incredibly beautiful, because only then we start to love these structures, we start to maintain them, and we start to use them the longest possible way. So that is the baseline where all these arguments need to start off. It is a value of beauty and the value, if you want to say, of love, right? That has to do with it. Number two, we should never forget that a material comes with a history and with an identification. The beauty and the quality of space is connected one-to-one to the way how we construct, how we feel, how we touch, how we smell, and what we see. It is not that we bring this value and say, now it's not valid anymore. But if we keep on running in the linear system, all of that value that you also mentioned in terms of economics, the impact of our environment, and so on, we destroy this constantly. So the question of reuse, the question of bringing materials back in the way how they were constructed, also brings back the question of identification, the belonging, the sense of culture. All of that is transported also by material. And therefore, the question of rematerializing housing is not only a technical one. It has very much to do with the space, with the region and the location and the material in itself.
But we can measure the economic costs. And okay, I take your point about technocracy, but actually there's a value in measurement, isn't there? I mean, if you're not measuring something, you don't value it, is something I've heard.
Yeah, but now we come to the point where we start measuring things, of course, that are technically being able to be measured. But how do you measure love, right? How do you measure social
That's my question,
right?
That's my question.
And that, of course, has to come through our discipline, through our education, through good examples, and through the, as you said, or as you pointed out, a value system that we give to our spaces, our buildings, and our materials, right?
But don't we need to value these intangible, emotional aspects of what we're doing? You say it has to be beautiful. Anna, you say it has to be made with love. But you talk about decommercializing in your use of natural materials. You're using materials that are already there, the earth, the soil. You're trying to decommercialize an industry that's utterly reliant on its commercialization.
Yes.
How are you possibly going to get your message through?
I'm trying to empower people to use what they have, the existing resources, to build something beautiful out of their means and not getting depending on external factors. That means resilience in the end. And I think it's also, it's in our DNA that we want to build. I mean, every child is playing to build, either with blankets, with branches, that's part of our DNA. And now we have completely delegated this act of building to the experts. I think designing, yes, we need experts, but to completely cut out the act of building and participation from our building processes, I think is not healthy also. And I think it ends up, that we receive the keys, or the clients receive the keys, then they run to IKEA, stuffing everything. We architects try to make the pictures before they come in with this IKEA stuff or these other things. But I think, this is a part of our DNA that we want to build. And I'm trying to put this either in big scale or at least in small scale in every building budget. But I think this empowering feeling is, and that ownership, that kind of feeling of identification, that also enhances the process of taking care is something that is important.
Stuart, you want to come in on this?
Just an observation. I mean, a lot of the buildings that I work on are in cities, and one of the reasons why with the circular building I wanted to build it in steel rather than another material was so that it could be scalable for the problems that we have in cities, massive urbanisation and so on. We find, or I find, designers like you don't appear in our cities as much as they should. We should be working...
I would love to.
Exactly.
I would love to. I have an earth shoot in Manhattan. I would love to. That's why.
Exactly. So that needs to change a bit, because there's a kind of, environmental building is seen as one thing, and building commercially is seen as another thing, and those two things need to come together much more, I think.
But answering your question and picking up that, what is the value system of different materials? You mentioned now concrete and steel and ground earth and stuff like that. And I think we should give up this discussion. We should not talk anymore about good materials and bad materials. We need them all. We need the whole palette. But I think we should start thinking differently about it, how we apply them, right? I think something Hannah did not mention yet was that in the end, the examples you showed, you could take that altar or whatever it is and kind of bring it back to its original state of the quality of the material itself. If we could buildings the same way as you think about that altar, I think then we reach really a state where we cherish and where we love and where we kind of take care of future generations. And unless we don't do it, all of that will lead to a disaster.
So we need to use, can we try and develop this a little bit?
Yeah.
Stuart, you spoke earlier today about the right and wrong use of different materials. Could you say a little bit about, when's the best time to use concrete and when's the best time not to use timber?
Yeah, so what we've seen in the industry probably for the last 5 or 10 years is just a simple message from many sources that wood is good. And that's simply it. And so lots of our buildings now, we're trying to experiment with building them in timber. But that's not appropriate for every building. And what we're seeing is that actually timber encapsulates carbon, but at the end of life it releases it back. And so there's lots of different scenarios with what could happen to that carbon. So it's not as simple as wood is good. You need to actually think through the design process. You need to think about why you're using a material, where it's come from and where it's going to. That important point about where it's going to at the end of life, I think.
So wood is good if you replace it, if you sequester the timber that you've felled for construction.
Or you design it for a long life. Durability and long use of structures is a key issue. We don't design enough for time in our projects, in our buildings. We don't think about the very long-term future. And so we could quite easily be storing up sort of a carbon problem in timber buildings for a future generation.
Well, with the durability is something, that I think is a very Western point of view. That's what I learned in Bangladesh too. I had no idea about bamboo when I started building, so obviously we had a mistake, we had a beetle attack, we had to take this thing down, and then, the bamboo was just growing, and the know-how was passed on from one batch to the workers to the next one, and then I understood, that the know-how that remains is the essential thing. The know-how to build with the existing resources, that is more than a permanence in materiality, because I think, it's an illusion. Everything will be eroding one day, and everything will decay in one day, and I think it's also part of our a core problem of sustainability is also that we have a problem with decay, and if we want to build in harmony with nature, and we have to accept that too.
This is what I find interesting about the circular economy as a way of driving our decisions, because if you can recover the materials but selectively for the ones that decay and replace them, but keep the ones that don't, you can then respond to changes in technology over time, the way our building's used, and all sorts of things without all of this damage.
But we need to change our regulations for that. I mean, imagine that thinking, right? You would apply today here in Madrid or in Germany or whatever. The first thing that happens after 10 years, the client is calling you saying, my facade right now is decaying. So, right? Who's paying for this?
Oh, but that happens a lot. How many construction after 10 years you have to really massive problems where you have to redo? It's just not what we're talking about. It's not in the papers usually, but it is happening a lot.
But we take the responsibility
as
architects.
Yes, we do, and I do too.
And I know there are other models, right? For example, looking at the Netherlands, where the architect is not in that role of taking all this responsibility towards a different culture of material decay and so on. So I think we have to question all of this. That's why I put up these 5 points. We have to question the system we are operating in. And how can it be that we have a culture, let's say, where we want to keep up a circular idea of a biological cycle, as you showed with the bamboo and so on, right? And then I accept that after 10 years, I have to change that facade. But you know what? I don't want to be called as an architect saying I have to pay for it. And that is something we have commonly.
Why don't you want to be called? Because
our value system is wrong. And
because you don't have a fee
for
that. But what if you had a fee for that? What if that was part of your professional appointment? And that's another of your...
Exactly. So we have to change this, right? We have to say that maybe it is accepted that after 10 years, I need to refurbish that. But what we do today is, because we are afraid of this, then we put a lot of chemical stuff in our wood. And what does it do? It destroys the wood. We can only burn it. That's the only thing left. And then we expose the CO2, which was supposed to be stored in that building. We expose it immediately again to our climate conditions. And that is wrong. So I think we can talk as architects, but we need to start talking with our regulation system as well.
Can I go back to plastic and perhaps just try another tack? Anna, do you use plastics in your buildings? And if you do, when do you?
We used one layer on top of the foundation to prevent the water from...
The concrete foundation?
Brick, concrete, cement, mortar foundation. Because, the bricks you can also recycle in a way. So in Bangladesh it's easier, so we started to do it with the brick foundation. Then we had one layer of plastic. But I think, there it is more useful than in carrying around in the plastic bags. But normally, all the rest... is fine. And for the downside, or for the dismantling plan, you take the roof off and it goes back to the ground.
And do you create dismantling plans in the way that Dirk was suggesting?
It's common
how does that sound to you? Would it be straightforward as an architect to say, okay, I have to design how to undo this building as well as to construct it? Yeah,
that's pretty easy. You take down the roof and then it goes back to the ground it came from, and you plant a garden on top.
On a small building, but when you're building your next city.
Then I would need same. You take down the roof and you need a lot of rain then.
And I'm sorry to bang on about plastic, but how are we going to live, Stuart, with plastic and find the right use for plastics? How do we remove them otherwise? Where are you on this?
Yeah, and plastic as a material is fantastic. It's really, what you can do with plastic you can't do with other materials. But we've got enough of it, right? So we just need to recover and use what we've already got.
Which means what? Harvesting ocean plastics?
Harvesting ocean plastics, making sure that this plastic doesn't end up in a waste stream and it's actually reused and remanufactured into new materials.
I'd like to ask about where you're seeing change happen in a moment. I'm just going to look around in every degree I can to just say in a few minutes we'll have an opportunity for some questions from the audience. So if you do have some, now is the time to put your hand up, and I'll be able to try and bring you in at the right moment.
Yeah.
So can we talk about where we're seeing impact, positive things happening? Clearly in your work, Anna, it's there, but I would suggest there's not enough of it. What is it? Where else are you seeing? How many other people are doing what you're doing? And what if this is not happening fast enough, can be done? Where should we focus our efforts to make it happen faster?
Yeah, I'm focusing also a lot on teaching, because there is a demand for that, and there are really lots of young colleagues who really want to go in it. It's still, a little bit of lacking the trust that you can survive financially with this kind of architecture. But I tell here everyone, yes, it's possible. Everyone is born with certain talents, and you need to trust in these talents. You're only good when you really listen to your heart and do what your heart tells you to do, and then go for it. And life will open the doors, and there will come an award that is completely out of the blue, or you get a good commission that pays you. It always went on like this. So there are the positive things that I see is really in the coming generations.
But let's focus again on the bottom up, right?
Yes.
I want to challenge.
We need
Exactly,
both. We
exactly,
need both.
yeah.
We cannot delegate it also to the next generation or to the
yes.
politicians. We have to be part of it, and we have to say no to things. We can, we have no resonance, and we say, okay, this is against my ethics. We have to say no, and we have to do the things we really can embrace.
Yeah, I mean, we are now seeing a lot of change in the EU in terms of taxonomy, which is starting to incentivise people to do things and giving them opportunities to make businesses out of it. So you already see some start-up companies and some recovering materials from buildings and reusing them. That started to happen in some locations. And all of that needs to accelerate pretty quickly.
Yes.
Talking of top-down, I want to give Laila Iskandar an opportunity to say a few words. I'll just introduce you, Laila, who is a former minister in the Egyptian government and a minister with responsibility for the environment, but also for unplanned settlement, a minister of slums. I'd never heard of a minister of slums before, but shouldn't every national government have one until there are no more slums? Laila.
So I'd like to speak as an African also. You have utterly confused me. You tell me now going back to local building materials, natural earth and bamboo is good for me, but that's what I was doing years ago, and you came to me and even moved all of your cement plants to Africa. Compare Google Maps today from 20 years. And now you're telling me, now that I've lost it, to go back to it. Also, I don't want my bamboo house to be flushed down by a storm, climate-induced one. So I'm now building the way you taught me, and I can't go back to the way you're telling me to do so. In Africa, I have been recycling all my life. But as a Minister of State for the Environment, I want to tell you, every week I used to have a European come sell me an incinerator, because that's what we were told was the thing to do. And when I refused all of these, they would go report me to my president and tell me, you have a backward minister who doesn't like technology. So now you're telling me to go back to recycling. I am confused.
That's why I'm also building with Earth now in Europe, and that's why it is so important. I think, we have to see each other as one global family living on one planet with limited resources, and we have to share these resources. And I think, we just have to go back to common sense logic in a way and to listen to our hearts rather than to someone else telling you something.
I think it will be a shame if we copy the same mistakes into other places and other locations. And I do think we now see, and we're sort of learning very quickly at the moment around carbon materials and so on, that if we were to design and build in a circular way, that would give us a much better future.
But I think don't be confused because building or the understanding of our built environment and with it the natural environment is not a status quo, right? It is something that is a moving target. And I tell you, the moment when I started thinking about all of that, it was when I was living for 3 years in Africa. Whatever you told me, I'm trying right now to implement that in a European community. You are superior, right? And we have to go back, exactly what you said. We have to go back to understand how we live without waste. I lived in Addis Ababa, right, in Ethiopia. There is no thing as waste as we know it. We have to learn from you and not the other way around. And I think that inspired me, and I would like that many people are inspired by Africa and the way you up till now, and don't give it up. Don't give it up.
Wonderful. Please, if anyone else wants to try to offer that, it was lovely to get a round of applause to a question. It suggests it's landed with you. We've got time for one more question before we will move on, please.
Hi, thank you all for your lovely words. And actually, my question arises because Anna, in her speech, said that as a society, we don't lack materials, we lack relationships. And as a student, I truly believe this. I feel like we are not really taught what type of relationships we should have. Like, it's only as an architect and a client maybe. But my question is, what type of relationships should we build to make meaningful buildings that hold a great impact on people's lives?
Empathic ones. I think, we have to learn not just designing the buildings, but also we have to learn to design the processes. And there is so much power for change in the process. And we just have to bring that back.
Thank you. I mean, for my part, I'm familiar with the work of Charles Montgomery, who writes about the happy city. And he takes on this, you think the happy city, what's that? But he deals with data throughout, health data, mental health data, loneliness data, physical activity, and describes the happy city and the unhappy city. And so I think, for me anyway, I think there are ways of harnessing what might seem otherwise soft and emotional in ways that are impactful, because I presume to the politician, this is the cost of an unhealthy population, and it's a risk as well. Lord Foster.
It's more a remark than a question, but it's provoked by your observation. Could you reflect on the knee-jerk reaction of almost fashionable cycles? At the point that I went as an architect to China, China was totally driven. Mobility was a bicycle. And just at that point, European cities were discovering the bicycle, and China was discovering what happened in the 1950s, which was the car-driven city. And right now, we're moving in a lemming-like rush to electrify mobility. So new filling stations, new industries, all driven by fossil fuel, because 86% of our energy is generated by fossil fuel, less than 3% by wind and solar. Whereas we know we have the technology to be able to, for example, turn seawater with clean energy into clean fuel. Could you reflect on that?
Yeah, I'll have a go at that one. I mean, we see it in the construction industry at the moment, and the conversation around timber, wood is good, that we had earlier. And what I see is that it's good for maybe some projects, but then to try and scale it up in this massive rush, as you call it, lemming-like rush, into then trying to build everything in timber, that's going to have massive unintended consequences. Do we know where all that timber's coming from? Do we know what's going to happen to the land that we're taking it from? Where's it all going to go? We're not planning to cause a carbon problem in the future, but if all of this timber suddenly starts to come back into the environment, that's going to cause us a problem. And it's the same with electrification in terms of batteries. Where are the materials coming from? And when you dig down into an electric car battery, you find it's made of all sorts of materials that come from all sorts of places with all sorts of consequences. So when you lemming-like scale that up massively to the scale of the planet, with 7+ billion people all trying to do the same thing, that's going to be a real problem. So you really got to think through all of those consequences before you rush into electrification, before you rush into building all of your buildings from timber.
Thank you. Time is, as always, against us, and we're going to wrap at this point and move on to the second part of our debate. So can I just ask everyone to thank Anna, Dirk and Stuart for their contributions. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I don't know about you, I thought that was a terrific start. It's got us warmed up. And now we're ready for part two, where we have 3 more speakers on the subject of the materiality of the buildings and cities that our planet needs to create, adapt for its troubled future. The first of our speakers is Johan Carlsson. And Johan is a designer by background, a sustainability entrepreneur, and he's managing director of Better Shelter. And Better Shelter is a social enterprise created in partnership between IKEA, who we just heard referred to earlier, and UNHCR. And Johan, you're the first of part 2.
All right, thank you very much. All right. Okay, thank you, everyone. So, we are having a wedding couple with us here. This is from Somaya in Iraq. This is a picture that we got some 3 years ago. This couple, they had been living in one of the emergency shelters that we had provided for 2-3 years at this point in time. They are still living in Somaya in Iraq. They have not yet returned to the central Iraq where they came from. They fled Daesh or IS, and the situation has not stabilized yet. There are 2 people out of 80 million people who are forcibly displaced. Right? 80 million people. So this is quite a substantial amount of people who are depending on humanitarian aid. And this challenge is growing. If we're looking at projections ahead, really driven by climate change, expert scenarios vary, but the most quoted figure for 2050 is we're going to have 250 million people displaced by climate change. So this is a very relevant topic, and we have a lot of students and scholars here today within architecture, and I really want to inspire you to work within this field. A lot of architects do, but very few gets into practice. And there's one lesson that you need to learn. I'm going to try to teach you this lesson in the remaining 3.5 minutes I have here. There are 2 ideas that we need to understand when we are working with humanitarian aid. One is what humanitarian aid is. It's about life-saving, alleviating suffering. So let's say humanitarian aid is like the ambulance service, right? I fall on this stage, I get a wound, I break a leg, they take care of me, they stop the bleeding, but they don't fix the problem, they take me to the hospital. Then you have development aid. Development aid is about state building resilient societies. And development aid is like the public healthcare system. So that's where I'm having the hospitals, where my symptoms are cured and I can go on with my life, right? Now, imagine we were now here in Madrid. I do fall out this stage right now, and I bleed. And an ambulance comes here to get me, but there is no hospital to take me to. So what do? Well, they fix my symptoms, but then the next one who gets hurt, eventually this ambulance will serve less and less. They will run out of medical supplies. The medics will not have, any Band-Aids left. So they will likely take the textiles from the seatings, to save people. But eventually it will not work anymore. Now, imagine if the city of Madrid would say that, we see we have a problem, because our ambulances cannot treat all the people. We're going to fix this problem by sending more ambulances. So they buy more ambulances. And imagine they do reach out to neighboring cities and towns to get funding for more ambulances because they need it, because people are getting hurt in Madrid and there's no hospital, so we need more ambulances. They will likely get in a humanitarian situation when there's a big emergency, when it's news, when it's on TV. They will get funding. Maybe in the 100 ambulances, they will get 120. People will support. But next year, they will have forgotten. Maybe they only get 20 ambulances, and then 15, and 10. But they never resolve the situation. This is the life and the reality of millions of people who are dependent on humanitarian aid. This is the situations they are in. And as a humanitarian designer, where I'm working in this field, this is a reality we need to live with. We are providing shelters that are lasting for years and decades. People are born in camps. They grew up, they marry, they get children. They eventually die in camps. But the shelter assistance, the architecture that they get, is designed for emergencies. And this is a political issue in the very end of the day, which is far above my pay grade to resolve, right? It's about what we allow them. But we do know as designers that we have to think when we provide, and this is what I want you to learn as students. Even though we are designing for emergencies, we have to make our solutions temporary. Otherwise, they will not be allowed. So if you do a nice hospital because you are smart and you say you need a hospital, you don't need an ambulance, it's not going to be used because it's not politically allowed in that situation. There is no incentive for development, right? So what you need to do is to develop emergency shelters that do last the duration of displacement, that can be locally repaired, locally upgraded, that are flexible, that are not set in stone, so they can adapt to the lives of people. Our shelters are supposed to last for 2-3 years. In practice, they are around for decades. And this is the challenge we need your help to support. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Johan. That was very powerful, and I think it shows what one image can do. Our next speaker may need no introduction, but Carme Pinós is one of Spain's foremost architects. Her work spans the scales from individual buildings to what you will see are some projects of significant scale. Carme.
Hello. First of all, my English is not fantastic, but I'm going to say that I'm not here to talk about my architecture. It's behind me, it's here, but it's not about that, the thing that I want to talk. I want to talk about my concern, about my inquietude. I'm going to say very obvious things that have been said before, but I remark how big is our responsibility, how architecture is the detonant of a lot of history, how we build the space that make relation. We must be so conscious that the society and the architecture is all together. It's an action, social action, the architecture. And also, when we build, we construct, but we start destroying. When we cut the trees to build, the trees die. When you change the topography, it's a way with no back. And we must be very conscious of that. Here I've been talking a lot of about materials. It's okay, but also we must claim the common sense. In a way, if we work in relation, in dialogue with the nature, for example, the orientation of the buildings to protect the sun, to study the movement of the wind, in a sense, work with the nature in the dialogue. Maybe because we talk a lot material, okay, but maybe if we study the climate, the movement of the earth, so the material become less essential. And we talk about materials that the technology give us, but be careful, the technology needs energy, in another, when we talk about natural material, also the natural material that can thrill us to work with this, but it's a goon of the nature. When you remove the material from the nature, it's always a goon. We must be constant and also dialogue with the nature, always dialogue with the nature. And another thing connected with our responsibility, said that the population in the 30 next years is going to grow up 2,000 million persons. That means we must think about another kind of city, another model of city. The discussion is not a compact city, a spirit city. It's another thing. always with this conjugation with the nature, with the dialogue with the nature. Maybe the city must have a limit. It's not, we can talk about 2,000 million of population for a city. Also because the earth needs breathe, and the concrete don't permit this. Maybe, and I say only one thing, is to enter in dialogue of the nature, the city, is not to plant trees at the long of the street. It's not to make beautiful park, beautiful garden. It's something more. The nature is not plants. It's more complex. It's the biophora, plants, vegetation, animals, everything. And we must find a way that the articulation of urban and nature, and I said this morning, no landscape. That landscape is something intellectual, no? Nature, with all his power. And we try to enter in dialogue with this nature. I don't know if my time. Okay.
Thank you, Carme. And towards the end, you were beginning to answer all the questions I was thinking I was going to ask you next. But I'll try and think of some more as well about the roles and responsibilities of the architect. And from one of Spain's foremost architects to one of India's foremost architects, Brinda Somaya has a particular appreciation of context, materiality, and I think the users of her buildings. Brinda.
Mine is not up yet. Yeah. This is the next one, yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. So the question is, do we always build anew? Or do we believe that existing buildings, irrespective of historicity, or whether they're new, or whether they're slums, or informal housing, do they have embodied energy within them? That's my question. So in 2014, I won a competition to restore and conserve the Louis Kahn complex at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. I was extremely excited because, as you can see, what I have shown in the red box was what we won. We were going to restore the historic library, the faculty block, the classroom complex, and 18 dormitories. We began work with a library and one dormitory. And today, because we're talking about rematerializing housing, I will stick to the dorm building. Although we did finish conserving the library, and it won a UNESCO Award of Distinction. But what happened? Here are some images of the dormitories under construction. All of you architects, of course, know of Louis Kahn and his magnificent work, and why he believed that this complex was a monastery. The interaction of the students with the faculty, the professors, the visitors, and the connections of space, light, sound, greenery, the brick, everything was interconnected. It was built by Indians, as you can see. Women played an important role, and it was completed. Then what happened? When we came in, we began work with the library, but when we checked on the dormitories, we found that they were not in a very good condition. So we began with one particular one, which was the worst, which was D15. A lot of interventions have taken place. And why beautiful 20th century buildings also begin to decay and repair is required because of water. Here we also had an earthquake. Water had infiltrated. Land becomes very expensive. Conserving the buildings becomes expensive. Aspirations of the students change, and questions begin to be asked. Is it worth it? Is it worth saving, irrespective of who the architect is or was? But what we did was, over time, there had been so many changes, we tried to take back the ground floor to what it was, which Kahn believed should be common spaces and not rooms. You can see what happened over time. We took that back, We brought back the original double height space, and then we didn't change the basic plan, but we upgraded facilities, whether it was the Wi-Fi, whether it was the toilets, the plumbing, the water supply, the drainage, etc. And you can see we even reused the old woodwork. Then what happened? Suddenly we heard that out of the 18 dormitories, 14 were going to be demolished because the Indian Institute of Ahmedabad believed that these 14 had suffered structural deterioration and were not worth restoring. This became an enormous controversy, and I was devastated because for me, that core was so important to set an example of why 20th century buildings need to have a life, irrespective. They have embodied energy within them. They need to be saved. In a country like India, we need recycling, retrofitting, restoration, repair. We cannot go on talking about new all the time. So there was outrage. I think Lord Foster was one of the people also who wrote. We got letters from all over the world regarding this, not to demolish. Questions were asked. There's a huge amount of information online for students who are interested to see what happened. So temporarily, the 14 dormitories, raising them has been stopped. But we really don't know what's going to happen. In the meantime, as I said, I finished the library, and I am now doing the faculty block. Octavio Paz, the famous Mexican poet extraordinaire and essayist, he said, the past is not past. The past is just passing by. The link that each one of us have to our physical surroundings is immeasurable. It gives us our sense of identity. It gives us our self-esteem. Now you all decide what you want to do, what you want to save, what you want to raise, and what you want to build anew. Is it justified? Thank you.
So much, Brinda. Thank you very much to all of our speakers in the second part. And my immediate takeaway, I don't know about you, is that we've heard something here about the purpose of the architect, the role of the architect, and the need, perhaps, for a different attitude in architecture and design in from each of our speakers. Johan, if I could start with you. I mean, the figures you gave were shocking. When I was looking to prepare for today, I looked and found that in 2020 there were 80 million people who were living in a displaced condition. And that figure had risen from 67 million people in 2016. And I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation. That's something like 2 families a minute. I then, just now, projected your figure to 2050, where you said 250 million people. That's 11 families per minute. This is an accelerating rate. And what you say about the condition of shelter that's being created strikes me as nonsensical, if I could put it that way. The UNHCR design guidelines on the design of shelters says you shouldn't make them permanent. Yet the lifetime typically of a refugee shelter is in decades. What does it take to raise heads out of the sand that aren't getting the realities that are not just happening now, but are getting worse?
Yeah. I believe that this is where we're having a very important job as architects and designers to do. Because as I said, that like UNHCR, I think with all respect, I mean, they are really working to address as many refugees as they can, right? You know, and in such a good way they can. But take a country like Northwest Syria. It's the UN resolution is there. There's a big debate. Should we help the people in Northwest Syria or not? Russia and China on one hand is saying no, the Damascus regime should support them. And the rest of the world is saying no, aid should come to Turkey. And you allow aid at a 1-year cycle. So you only plan for 1 year each. Everybody knows the situation is, I mean, Syria conflict has been going on for 10 years now. It's not going to change. But the constraints for every intervention that we do as architects is 1 year. But I think as an architect and designer, we can know this. We can design shelter structures that are temporary, but that can be, you know, repurposed, refitted, reused, upgraded during the lifespan. We don't have to make a tent just because it's temporary. There are other options available. And I think that's where you're having a creative opportunity that we can address.
Is this happening? Is this happening, or is it what's needed?
No, I think it's, yes, it's...
There's a lot of young people
with
us today.
It's happening, but it's so much, most things remains to be done, I would say. It is happening. And I would also like to underscore that a refugee camp is a last resort. We had the lecture this morning. The most sustainable thing you can do is not to build anything. That is true also in refugee settlements. If you can rent apartment from host communities, that is better, because they are likely, you know, permanent from the beginning. It stimulates the local economy. It gets a benefit to the host community. So that is what UNHCR is doing that. Or can you rebuild locally? You do that as well. But again, the problem is not only with this, 80 million to 250 million people. The problem is also that people in these protracted situations where you live on emergency aid, you know, where you only do ambulances, you don't build any hospitals, you just send more ambulances. Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Venezuela, these types of crises are increasing. And they are the result of a global political level, which I think that we as architects, designers cannot really resolve. But we can work with creativity within these boundaries and push things in the right way. Yeah.
I'm tempted to look at Lila for the answer to all our governmental problems, and I don't want to put you on the spot right now, but that does strike me as being a need to reform the governance that goes into creating what are crazy rules.
And I want to confirm what Johan just said. In Egypt, we host 1 million Syrians. Yeah. Nobody knows that. We did not build one single tent. No. They all live in rented apartments from host communities. And before them, we had South Sudanese, and now Ethiopians, Eritreans, and others. But yes, there is no need for tent. In every big city in the south even, there's always vacant flats that can accommodate.
Perhaps I could develop this idea of the rapidly urbanizing, rapidly growing populations of the planet. Carme, you talked about 2 billion new people living on the planet to 2050. Yeah. And you showed work, as you spoke, which included large, I want to call it landscaping, but you're telling me I should call it nature, not landscape, because landscape is a created intellectual concept and nature is nature. That's one thing I've learned from you. Can you say something about what is the settlement in your mind? Should we be repurposing cities in the way that we've heard about repurposing buildings to find place for this 2 billion people? Or if we need to build new cities, what's the right size? What's the right location?
I think everything has a measure, also the cities. I think we must find the measure of one good city, and maybe is articulate different cities with easy and public transport, and in between with this articulation with nature. Maybe at the end all the planet is going to be a city, I don't know, but a city articulate with nature. Is that not this contrast that exists now in Mexico? I work a lot in Mexico. The city have 20 million, and then the countryside is completely empty, and everybody want to go to the city for find opportunity. Maybe we must think, no, first, this kind of new model of city, this to find the measure, how a city start to be complicated, the
people are coming into the city to work, I presume.
To work, to find, but
So it's not, I mean,
yeah.
we're here to talk about rematerializing housing, but it sounds to me that we must go beyond housing.
Yeah, because, but I believe in politics. I believe in government. And I think it's a duty that they have to control a little the economy. Because the problem of this concentration of immigrants, we don't must think about if the house is permanent or not. We must give opportunity to have his own dignity, to have his own work. We must change the system to permit that these people that now are to decide if they want to go in another side because they have work. We must change the capitalism in a way.
And do you see that as the role of an architect? Do you see that?
No.
How does a designer take on these challenges of governance?
In a way, we must work all together. This is for our engineer, this is for architect, this is for economy. But the goal is to work for the humanity. The technology seems that the technology and the progress have sense inside of progress. What the progress must be in the direction to give all the humanity happiness, dignity. And seems that progress make each time more different. The privileged and also we talk about with this sense of charity of the people that the system have margin, and where I'm concerned is the houses are permanent or not permanent. No, we must give dignity to them to decide where they want to live.
I'd like to bring Brinda, if I may, in on this discussion about involving the people who occupy the buildings and places that are created. I mean, a lot of your work, I've learned, is the process of design, of working with the people who are going to occupy buildings. And we heard a quote earlier, the greenest building is the one that's already built, and your case study exemplified that in many ways. And I looked it up, Carl Elefante, the greenest building is the one that is already built. You've made buildings from other people's waste as well. What would have been considered waste material, you've made your architecture of that. It doesn't sound very glamorous to be working this way. And it doesn't sound to me that this is how the architectural profession has been educated to practice. Could you say something about what you know is the true purpose of architecture?
If I may say something about what happened before, about cities for a minute. In India, we are currently 60% rural, 40% urban. Around that, keeps changing. By 2050, we're going to have 400 million people coming from rural areas into the city. So we're talking about a few 100,000 refugees here and there. So you can imagine the problems that we have in many parts of the world. How are we going to address that? This is going to be the largest human migration that has ever taken place after the historic separation of India into Pakistan and India and Pakistan, when we had 10 million refugees go between the two countries, 10 million. And even today we have what we call refugee colonies, not tents, but refugee colonies where we have Afghan refugees, we have the refugees from 1947 as well. So the problems and the solutions for cities have to be radically different. We have to think out of the box. We have to come up with new solutions. I don't have the answers, but the immensity of what we are all going to see, not just in India, but in many parts of the developing world. So some of the solutions that the West is coming out with, I don't think it's going to be applicable. I think we have to develop, and we are doing that in India, our own R&D centers, and trying to address how are we going to address these problems. One solution was try and develop the villages more because then they will not move to the cities. That did not work. People still see the city as the golden goose that lays the egg. And they're always going to have that drive, that ambition, that aspiration to come to the city. To take your second point up, I do a lot of other types of architecture as well. It's not just that, but that is, I don't separate building from the context and the process. So it doesn't matter whether it's a tiny little house where I use leftover materials from contractors because the people who are living there don't have the funds, or whether I'm building a 1 million square foot campus, which I also do. But the rules are common, the beliefs are common, the emotions are common, the priorities are common. What do we consider is important? What are our responsibilities as an architect? That is uniform, that stays the same. And that's what I believe.
Thank you. So, Johan, if you had the talents in this room at your disposal, and you do, because everyone's here to participate and ask questions and be part of this, where would you place them? What are the key challenges that you face right now that are so urgent that they need help?
No, I would face them within many of our NGO and UN partners. I mean, the presence of architects is very, very limited. Right, so there is not the knowledge or the capacity to deal and address and plan with problems within these very tough conditions that we are operating. So that is really one thing. And then, of course, so I think NGO, UN has a large role to play, but of course also government, civil society, to work with this. Now I want to just to reinforce that I'm all for, what we are doing, this type of sort of life-saving aid. It's not desired, right? It's the last safety net that we are doing, right? It's when nothing else works. Because I fully agree, if we can rebuild back better, build locally, involve the community, build things that last us, makes sense, that we should go for it always. There are many projects that we roll out from, for example, in Bangladesh, because we see there's no sense of us sending these type of structures here when we can rebuild them better, quicker, cheaper, faster locally, right? So it's not that I'm saying that this is a formula we are doing that should apply everywhere. I just happen that I'm working in these situations where nothing else works. Supply chains are out. There is one entry point to Syria, one entry point where you can go and ship stuff, right? And you're having 1.7 million people who don't have anything, really. There's an acute need of shelter. There's one point that's open to deliver aid. So that's where I'm working. So I'm not saying that that is the right environment to work. And I think there are many other, you can work in development housing and do fantastic and achieve fantastic stuff. I think that trying to link what we are doing in humanitarian relief into longer term development, that's what's required. There's a fancy word called that among humanitarians, they call it a nexus, that you're going to link humanitarian aid to development aid. And we just had a chat on the way here. I think the only way where I've seen that working in practice is actually in India. Our Indian NGO partners, but because also it's a different situation. It's a government, it's a governance, it's a civil society that's engaged. They were seeing it, but it's a lot to do that. And I'm all for, we want that to happen. But as I said, we also need to be listening to the constraints. I mean, frankly, if anyone here would set up an NGO to support shelters in Syria, you would get all the funding and all the resources and the capacity you would get. None of you would get any permission to build anything with a brick because it will be deemed permanent. Right, that's the reality. And now take away that we're also having other, like funding. 1 out of 5 targeted families receive funding. 1 out of 5. Right, and when we're discussing funding for family, it's around $50 per person. So we are having the budget scope. So there are many challenges here. It's not only the political one. So that's where I would want us, to work.
Say something here, it's not just the refugees.
No.
The same problem exists even with permanent citizens. For instance, why do we have so many slums in Mumbai? Why do we, informal housing or whatever euphemistically you want to call it? It's not that the people who live in slums are impoverished. They have schools, they have medical centers, they have gymnasiums, they are often chartered accountants, but the government will not allow them the land. And when they don't own the land, as Johan said, then you don't want to build a permanent house or a brick house because you don't want to invest your money in something that can be demolished. This is the weakness. So the government has to come in, policies have to change, empathy has to come in. People know that the refugees do not disappear. We have refugees for decades and decades. We've had Afghan refugees in Delhi for the last 25 years. So, you know, it's not a recent problem.
This is interesting to me because the connection between an emergency relief camp, a refugee camp, and an unplanned settlement is something about uncertainty, temporality, risk, yet, and my experience doesn't extend to emergency relief camps, but the work that we've done together in unplanned settlements in India, other work I've been involved in, unplanned settlements are some of the most sustainable places on the planet. Yeah. They're walkable. Carme, you live close to where you work in an unplanned settlement. It's sometimes just downstairs or upstairs. Yet, they're some of the least well-built places. You know, talking about materiality today, there seems to me an enormous need for the Earth's resources to be devoted to unplanned settlements, to upgrade them, not in terms of their planning, but in terms of their construction. Am I close with this? Is this something that...
I think they should get an award, not the architect. Suppose you take an unplanned settlement and you give the people who have sustained that settlement, lived there, built up all the infrastructure themselves, and they get an award. What message will you be sending to the rest of the city? What message will you be sending to the politicians over there and the bureaucrats who sit in their offices? You will tell them, these people, under such severe constraints, have built a livable city, a city within a city with no help from anybody. And they need the award.
We talked in the first half about the valuation of materiality and the conventional valuation of the sort of economic cost. But it seems to me what you're describing is, if you think of the social cost, the health benefits of living a more active, more walkable. There are other health detriments in unplanned settlements. They're not the panacea, are they? But if we could create a proper valuation, then the award would be a
You know, in Mumbai, they had the least COVID.
Yeah.
Yes, the Ravi, they organized themselves so well. They had all these little medical centers, and all the rich people in the big apartment buildings had it, and they sorted out themselves, and they're fine. They're going on with their lives. What does this say?
Yeah.
What does this say? We have a few minutes before we're going to conclude. I'll just break in. Carme, I'll bring you back in. But if anyone wants to add to this discussion, please put your hand up so that we can take one or two questions before the end. Why don't we do that now? We've got a microphone on the way. Just hang on to your question. Carme, did you want to come in, or should we hear the question?
No, it's only a comment that we are talking a lot about India, but our city in Occident are not healthy. We must think also about our cities.
Our own condition in the West.
How the development of our city is not the best. How grow up with the industry that make. I think we must think about a new model of city for us too.
Of perhaps trying to, Norman's point from the first half of the West pursuing the bicycle while the East was pursuing the motor car. I mean, trying to close some of these developmental loops. Please.
So I would like to start saying that I'm not even an architecture student. I'm 17, and I'm looking forward to be an architecture student. And during this debate, it has been mentioned several times that architecture is practically interdisciplinarity. But especially, it has been said a lot about politics, and that there's a need of a paradigm shift based on political measures and political changes. But my question is, if I want to study architecture, and if I'm looking forward to it, what can make me do? Rethink why I have to study architecture, and what does specifically architecture give to politics in terms of social changes and rematerializing housing?
Thank you very much for that question, which really I think frames the discussion in this session. Who would like to offer the first response?
Yeah.
You may have to answer your own question, by the way, afterwards, of where you see yourself in 10 years. But let's see how our experts do first.
I think we are in a very difficult moment of our evolution in Occident, no? And we must work all together to find solution, because if we leave the market and the progress go ahead, each time we are more in opposition. No? To find this equilibrium is to work and to believe with politics. In a way, we have the politics that we deserve if we vote the not correct,
So
and you permit the corruption of the say. But we must trust with politics, but because it's the one that can change and work together. No?
We have to engage. We have to engage.
Yeah,
Sorry, time's
absolutely.
against us. Brinda. I might come to Lila again. What kind of architect?
The best profession in the world, and I love it. It's not easy, it's difficult, it's all encompassing, it's tangible, it's intangible, it's romantic, it's dull, it's traumatic, it's delight. It's got everything going for it. It's got archaeology, it's got history, it's got sociology, it's got economics, it's got the mother of all the arts, it's got everything. Just go for it.
Right. Okay, beat that, Johan.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I would just agree. And I think that the most valuable contribution I would see of an architect is that you can generate what is not invented yet. Typically, when you're having political discussions, you're discussing two alternatives, as in Syria, brick house or tent. There are an array of options that you can work with in there, within these fields, that are much better than a tent, but it's not a brick house yet. You can visualize, you can bring the solutions, and they will have an impact for dignity and safety of families. They may create livelihoods, etc. I think that is critical, because you can give shape to that. And that can move politics, you know, even if you're working within the system. So.
Thank you. We've got hands shooting up all over the place now. We may only have time for two. I'm so sorry, because they're over in this direction. There was one or two. If you can ask a quick question, you can pass the microphone on, and we'll answer them both at the same time.
Okay. I'm focusing on rematerializing housing. Johan was
hold the mic up to you.
Oh, sorry. Talking about rematerializing housing, Johan, I think, was talking about social crisis, and also Carme talking about Mexico City, such as other cases as Venezuela and stuff. I wanted to ask, as architects, we cannot solve these problems objectively, as you said. So are you thinking of using architecture as an idea to encourage and to link governments and people to achieve this change we're talking about?
Let's just stop at that point and seek some answers.
No, I think absolutely. I'm a firm believer, and I've seen it so many in other architects' work within humanitarian relief, where you get good examples. And I think that when you get that good example, that can change politics and perceptions. I'm all for it. There is a genuine power there. Donors rethink how they spend the money. Agencies rethink how they provide aid. Right? So we have come a long way, I think, already. But there's so much work that needs to be done still. So.
Thank you. Well, look, I'm going to suggest that's a good note on which to close this part. I'm going to try and offer some concluding comments. Please stay with me on the stage, because we've just got a couple of minutes to run, unfortunately. We always wish we could have longer. I've been making a lot of notes, and from both parts of the debates, I've written here there are 3. It's probably going to be 5, but let me start. There are 3 obvious immediate messages that I've put down. I mean, the first is to embrace, I've written history, but I think it's something like a social collective consciousness. Aldo Rossi referred to the collective memory of a place. And there's something in what we've heard, especially from Brinda, about that. The second, to embrace context, placing buildings in that larger scale of the city. These, but they're pretty eminently reasonable conclusions. I think any decent architect or urban planner would get them even before they become one. I think the third one for me is a bit more challenging, which is to embrace nature, embrace dirt in Anna's work, and to embrace waste and repurposing and taking down and rebuilding. That's not in the traditional education of an architect. And I think this poses real challenges for us that still need to be explored, because most of us have never practiced the way that you've practiced, the way that you've proposed, the way that you've all practiced on stage. We're just not in this context. And then maybe my final thought, which I think now makes it 4, is about people, and particularly this half, which I think where the overriding concern has been perhaps less about the materials and more about the people. And so, yes, of course, rematerializing, to me, then takes on another definition of perhaps rehumanizing the way that we build, and in so doing, rematerializing the way we build. We've heard, and I couldn't help but notice when Stuart commented, wood is good and plastic is fantastic. Those to me are just simply memorable. And the romantic and the dull is something I've just taken away from a comment that Brinda made. I hope what everyone has seen are 6 very different approaches to a common passion for thinking and doing differently. So in a moment, I'd like you to thank everyone for their participation today. First, I'd like to thank the Holcim Foundation for its support of today's public debates, and to Lord and Lady Foster and all the trustees at the Norman Foster Foundation for their intellectual foresight. Thank you all very much. Thank you.